Well, the coronavirus pandemic has dealt a heavy blow on South Africa's once vibrant tourism industry. According to Stats SA tourism satellite account in 2018, total tourism spend in South Africa was 273.2 billion rand. Domestic tourism accounted for 56% of total spend, and 44% of this was international inbound travel. But to unpack this story further, I'm now joined by Chifiwa Chibenga as the Chief Executive Officer at the Tourism Business Council of South Africa. A very good morning to you, Chifiwa. Thank you very much for joining us on the AM edition of Newsfeed. Just contextualize the losses incurred in terms of job cuts, unemployment and even revenue losses since the beginning of the lockdown in South Africa.
No, thank you for having me. And since the lockdown, we have had 68 billion rand worth of losses for the past 3 months that we haven't been operational. And for each day that we are not operating, we lose around 748 million rand per day. We are in the process now of quantifying that to jobs in terms of how many jobs are going to be lost per day if we are not operational, and also to quantify it in terms of domestic and international. So that is the situation that we are in, and we are hoping that with the advanced level 3 regulation, we will be allowed to start operating domestic leisure travel, which will complement the already business travel that we are allowed to do here in South Africa. So it is a dire situation. We have seen many jobs being lost. We will continue to see many jobs being lost. Many people are on the UIFTS program, which has now entered the last month. So if nothing at all happens, we don't open, we don't have the UIF, there will be mass job losses come next month.
Just actually looking at the impact that the lockdown has had on the sector, perhaps re-looking at the modus operandi. I mean, you mentioned that there are quite a few, individuals are employed. There are over 700,000 people employed in the ecosystem of tourism in South Africa. That's a very labor-intensive sector. In terms of the relief funds and what the options available are to those in the sector as they mitigate against these challenges during these unprecedented times, I mean, what is the plan from here on to?
No, absolutely. We haven't had much of the relief fund. What we had is the 200 million rand that was made available by the Department of Tourism to help the small businesses, of which we are thankful for. But it would have been better to have a bigger fund that can help to sustain the small businesses during these difficult times. Another fund that's there is the 500 billion rand, of which the minister announced yesterday that now companies that have a turnover of over 300 million can now apply. That can help the big companies within our space. Now, when you look at these measures that have been taken, for us as a sector that's heavily impacted, that's going to continue to be impacted post-COVID, it's going to be very difficult for us to operate sufficiently without additional assistance that is set aside for our sector. So we have been calling on government to say, look at this industry differently. We are labor intensive. We create jobs in places where there are no jobs. And therefore, we believe that we should be looked at differently. We should be given more funds. I have looked at what the Minister of Finance have presented yesterday in terms of the full, budget. And I have seen that inside the full budget, there is a cut of 1 billion rand from the tourism industry. When you have a cut of 1 billion rand, which is I can equate it to 40% cut, which is probably the largest cut that I've seen when I compare other departments. So it is concerning because at this time, in order to stimulate demand, sustain the industry, should we open, we need to market ourselves both locally and also internationally to make the tourists can come into this country.
Chifiwa, speaking of that coordinated response and obviously the recovery, becoming rather slower than expected at large, I just want to look at some of the concerns and the demands that you have going forward. I mean, based on the issues that you highlighted for the tourism sector, I mean, ultimately, what are you looking for from government, as the lockdown levels are restricted, but balancing the fact that the main objective is to save lives at the same time?
Look, this is what we're looking for. One, before we look for anything, we develop the safety protocols to guide our sector throughout the value chain to make sure that we mitigate the spread of the virus. Now, what we're looking for is, number one, we need to open domestic leisure travel, and we also need to allow people to travel interprovincially. That will help our sector. Then we need to look at international. We need to get international going at least by September. If we cannot do all this, we need to look at how this sector can be assisted to continue. And it's going to take billions of rands every month to keep this sector afloat. As I've said, you're looking at around 22 billion rand a month. That is a tourism spend into the tourism economy. So it means that, at some point we need to agree and say, well, is it a 10 billion rand that will help the sector to be afloat for the next while? And that's 10 billion rand per month that will need to keep this sector going. If we don't do anything at all, we have a risk of losing 600,000 jobs. We have presented that even to the portfolio committee. The minister knows this as well. And if we continue, after losing the 600,000 jobs, there are other sectors that are dependent to tourism, like agriculture, manufacturing, and many other sectors. The manufacturers of vehicles, for example, 12.5% of vehicles that are manufactured locally are bought by car rental companies. It means that if we do not continue to operate, those cars will be lost. And it means that the retail sector is going to be impacted, and there will be jobs that will be lost in those sectors. And there are a lot of people who may think that, I don't work in tourism, but you support tourism. We buy goods and services from yourselves. And we believe that an additional 600,000 jobs will be lost. In total, 1.2 million jobs. So it's a dire situation, and we need to act now, and we need to act fast in order to save this industry.
If you are, just preparing for the recovery and reshaping the tourism sector at large, I mean, we've seen the response, the COVID-19 response measures that have been put in place, obviously, to protect people, ensure business survival, and then obviously reopen and re-prepare the economy. But I want to look at some of the global trends that are coming out in terms of the tourism sector, and what is emerging on that front. How can some of those best practices be adopted to a South African context? And also then just looking at the coordinated response at large. I mean, the role of technology has also come to the fore. How are we going to utilize that to also help re-look at the way the industry is operating currently?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that we have been talking to our counterparts in other countries. We've been talking to our business counterparts in New Zealand and Australia, and we've been sharing notes and comparing notes. And what we're going to need to do is to take the best practices around the world. Now, if you look at what's happening in Europe in terms of how the countries are opening up their tourism economies, they're doing it in a way of bubbles, bridges, and corridors, where, you look at the risk of the country or a region and you say, well, we can receive people coming from this region or from these countries. And then you create a bridge so that people can start to travel between those two places. We need to look at those particular things ourselves. And we'll continue to be guided by the World Travel and Tourism Council, the UN WTO, which is the UN World Tourism Organization, to really harness the best practices that have been implemented across the world. And we don't want to do this in an unsafe way, where we just say we open and everyone should come. We want to do it in a calculated way, in a measured way, in a phased approach, to ensure that those that are willing to travel and that are ready to travel, do so in a safe way. And when they arrive in our country, they do so under the protocols that we have developed. And we believe that can be done safely. So looking at international practices, being guided by international tourism organizations is the way to go. And also looking at what the World Health Organization is saying, together with our own Department of Health. And taking all these experiences together, we think that we can put together a unique experience that's going to be safe and secured, and that will save the industry.